Once we understand that our goal of editing food photographs is to make them look realistic, we're going to take a look at the 6 core editing effects that can help us achieve that goal. And by the end of this lesson, you should have a good handle on what contrast is and how it affects your photos, how to remove noise, and a few other elements that are really important for editing food photographs. We'll also take a look at the difference between shooting in RAW and JPEG format. We've talked about that a few times in passing, and here we'll take a deeper look at the practical differences between these two file formats. When editing food photographs, you don't need to know how to use every feature of your editing application. To my count, there's over 75 dials just on the right sidebar of Lightroom alone. Now, I don't know how to use every one of those, and if you really want to learn all of the details, there's a great course on that on Udemy, there's books, but for our purposes, again, what we want is for our photos to look realistic. And to accomplish that goal, I use 6 core editing effects for all of my pictures. They're very simple, and I rarely stray from these. So the first thing I'll do is I'll crop and straighten my image. Then I'll adjust my white balance. Then I'll adjust the exposure. I'll take a look at the contrast to see how that's affecting the image. I'll sharpen it if it's needed. And finally, I'll take a look at whether the image has too much noise, and that needs to be reduced as well. This video is going to be kind of a crash course in these 6 elements and how they can make your food photos look so much better. The first thing I usually do is crop and straighten my photos. Some people do this last, but I like to do this first because it gives you the right composition and the right framing, so you have that in mind as you're doing all the other edits. Cropping is the word that basically means when you pull the edges of your image in. So it makes it smaller, or in a sense it zooms in your picture. Now you can crop any of your 4 edges. So if your image is way off to the right and you want it to be more centered, pull the left edge in and it's going to be cropped more centered. Or you can pull the top or the bottom down, and you can adjust all 4 edges as needed. Along with this is straightening your image. And this is where you basically just rotate your image. So if the horizon line, or in this case the edge of the wooden table in the background, was tilted off to the right because my camera was at the wrong angle, I can straighten it by just rotating the image slightly to the left, and then it's straightened out. And as you can see on this apple cider, I've done both of those. The original image is off to the left, so it's been straightened a little. I've also pulled the top and the bottom down, so it's been cropped and straightened a little bit. Now when you're doing this to your image, you want to keep in mind the rule of thirds, which we talked about before. And as you can see here, this is a screenshot from Lightroom, and they conveniently give us a grid as we're cropping our image to show us those dividing lines, which can be really helpful if you want to crop your image according to the rule of thirds, which again says you should keep the focal point along one of the dividing lines, vertically or horizontally, or one of the points that intersect those horizontal and vertical lines. This will keep your image kind of asymmetrical, and they say it's more pleasing to the eye. So keep that in mind as you're cropping and straightening your image. Another thing to keep in mind that we've talked about briefly, and we'll talk about more in the next section, is social media. Pinterest likes tall images, they get more real estate and they get more notoriety, whereas Instagram only accepts square pictures. So keep these sizes in mind if you plan on sharing your images online. But one thing to watch out for is that cropping your images will reduce the resolution if you crop them too much. For example, if I crop the image all the way down to that one red apple and the entire picture was just that apple, it would be similar to zooming in the picture, but there's no more resolution, so it's going to start looking grainy and fuzzy and really low resolution if you crop it too much. So you're best off just barely cropping the edges so you don't change the resolution too dramatically. And that's kind of what I did here in this picture, just minor edits around the edges, but a more negative example would be something like this. You can't just say, I'll take a really wide picture and then crop it down to whatever I need. That's not going to work so well. It's going to reduce the resolution of your image, and you can do it as a last resort if you really have no other option, but try to be more mindful of how you want to crop your images and then shoot them with that composition rather than waiting until editing to do it. Once I have my images in the right size and the right composition, that's when I take a look at the white balance. Now notice this picture of the sushi over here. It's very, very yellow. It's not very white balanced. But if I adjust the white balance, then it looks more natural. So you can see, looks like that, and then more natural. So white balance is a tricky subject because your brain can interpret colors that exist beyond what they're actually looking at. Your brain has kind of these magical built-in white balancing systems that you aren't even aware of. But cameras aren't quite that smart. They do have white balance settings, but sometimes they get it wrong. And your mind, for example, if you walk into a room and it looks like the other sushi picture, where it's all yellow and dark and there's weird lighting, you won't even notice that because your mind will compensate for that white balance that's messed up, and it'll see the picture as it should be seen. And that's kind of an amazing feature of how our eyes and our minds work together. And I actually put a link in the description of this video to a fantastic TED Talk. And it's a really fascinating video that shows how our minds are really creating illusions all the time. But the camera is not doing that. So when we look at a two-dimensional picture, our mind isn't going to compensate for the weird white balance. It's just going to see what's in front of us. And this is why it's important to manage your white balance. And the white balance, in terms of definition, is just how yellow or blue your image looks. If it's too yellow, it's going to be called too warm. And if it's too blue, it's going to be called too cool. And what you want is that place right in the middle where the whites look white. And again, our goal with food photography is to make things look as real as possible. So the first step is to have real color representation by making our whites look as white as possible. So this is why I adjust white balance first and foremost, because it makes the biggest impact on your image's color representation. If you're using a DSLR, you don't have to worry so much about this when you're shooting. You can actually just leave your camera onto the auto white balance setting and it won't matter because it's shooting a raw file, which we'll talk about at the end of this lesson. But if you're using an iPhone or a point and shoot camera that's shooting in JPEG format, then your white balance is severely limited, and it's very important to make sure that your white balance is correct as you're taking the photo. We'll talk about this again later, but for now, understand that raw images, you can adjust the white balance as much as you want on the natural image, but a JPEG is basically flat and static, and you're going to have very little control over the white balance after the picture has been shot. The next effect that I usually use on my images is exposure adjustments. Exposure is simply the amount of light that hits the sensor of your camera. So if you have too much light hitting your camera, that's what's called an overexposed shot. It'll be too bright, it'll be washed out in a sense, and the whites will be overflowing in the picture. If it's too dark and you have too little light, that's called an underexposed image. And if you look at these examples, the one on the left is an underexposed image. There's just not enough brightness. And this was my fault. I messed up the shutter speed and everything else. And the one on the right is maybe a little bit overexposed, but it's more natural to what you're looking for. And because I shot in RAW format, I had a little more flexibility, and I was able to kind of fix this picture and make it look decent by adjusting the exposure. And the exposure can be increased in editing with a simple dial. You just make it more exposed or less exposed. But adding too much exposure isn't free. It comes with the cost of adding more noise and speckles to your picture in the dark spots. So you do have to keep that in mind, and it's best if you can to always get the right exposure through the camera right into the sensor. You won't have to edit it much, the pictures will look better, there'll be less noise. So as always, try to get the best shot through the camera and then adjust the exposure levels slightly if you need to in editing. Contrast is the next thing I take a look at. Contrast is simply the difference between black and white in your picture. You can think of it as the difference between those two extremes. For example, you can see here, the one on the left is very low contrast, and the one on the right is more natural contrast. So it looks almost like there's a grayish film over the front of the left side, and the right side just looks real and it pops. So higher contrast does make your images look bolder, but they can start to look unrealistic if you go too far. But lower contrast, as you can see on the left-hand side of this picture, makes your images look very dull and gray because the blacks and the whites are not as extreme. They're both kind of merging towards a gray that looks kind of dingy. So here's an example of the three contrast extremes. We have the extremely low contrast on the left, a more natural and accurate contrast in the middle, and a way over contrasted image on the right. And again, our goal with food photography is to make our pictures look as real as possible. The one in the middle looks real, fresh, it's popping out of the picture, but it doesn't look unrealistic like the one on the right. So you want to keep your contrast in the middle, make minor adjustments that either take away a little bit of the extremes or add a little bit more of a definition between the blacks and the whites if your picture needs that to look more realistic. The next thing I look at often is sharpening. This determines kind of the amount of clarity that's in your picture. Sharpening creates more pronounced edges in your images, so the pixels themselves will have sharper edges, the image won't be quite as rounded. The result of this is that it gives you more clarity. If you look at this ice cream, it's kind of hard to tell. There's not a huge difference, but the one on the right has a lot more sharpness. You can see the details in the ice cream much more clearly. Especially around the top there, you can see all those little divots that aren't visible on the left side because it's too fuzzy. But the problem with increasing your sharpness, just like with exposure, is that it adds a lot of noise to your picture. If you can see this, you may not be able to, but there's more noise. There's more speckles on the right side of the picture. So the right level of sharpness would probably be somewhere between these two options. The one on the left is just a little too dull. The one on the right has a little bit too much noise. So if you do adjust your sharpness, you want to keep it minimal. Finally, we've talked about noise a few times. Noise are those speckly artifacts that show up on the darker portions of your image, and they don't look very appealing. They're not what you want in your picture. These are more likely to show up at high ISOs. Remember, when you bump up the ISO on your camera, it's more sensitive to light, but the cost is that the image has a lot more noise. Thankfully, we can do a little bit of noise reduction in post-processing through the right applications like Lightroom. This is a helpful technique if you're taking pictures in low light, or if you're using a cheaper camera that doesn't have the larger sensor so that it doesn't gather as much light, and then it's going to have to bump up the ISO. So a higher quality camera is going to give you more light. It's going to be less likely to be adding extra noise to the picture. But if you have a lower quality camera, it can make a lot of sense to try reducing some of that noise. But as with all other effects, there is a downside here, which is that your images can look a little softer and too fuzzy. Again, the opposite of sharpness. You want your picture to be sharp and crisp and clear, but you don't want too much noise. So it's up to you to find the right balance so that your images look as real as possible. And here's just a clearer example of how noise reduction can help your images. This is a pretty poor quality picture that I took in fairly low light on a chalkboard with a low quality camera. And the result is that on the left you see a lot of noise. On the gray chalkboard background, it's not very clear. There's lots of little speckles and artifacts. Whereas on the right, I bumped up the noise reduction feature in Lightroom, which I'll show you how to use in the next video. And the image is a lot smoother, and in this case, it didn't reduce the sharpness too much, although there is a little bit of a reduction. So again, keep in mind how noise and sharpness work together, and ultimately your best option is to shoot in plenty of light so that you don't have as much noise, and you don't have to deal with this issue at all. Now we've taken some time to look at all the editing effects, but I would prefer you spend very little time editing at all. And the way you do that is by taking better pictures from the start. The best editing is the kind you do before you ever take a picture, in terms of setting up your composition so it doesn't have to be cropped, in terms of making sure you have plenty of light, which is really important, so that you have a lower ISO, your pictures won't have as much noise, the sharpness will be better. If you get these things right before you take pictures, it'll save you so much time on the back end. So be mindful of your lighting, be mindful of your composition, and the higher quality your camera, the less time you're going to have to spend editing. I've mentioned several times how when I switched from a point and shoot to a DSLR, my editing time was cut in maybe a third, because the images naturally looked so much better right out of the camera. And that's one of the biggest advantages of using a nicer camera. You just don't have to do as much to the pictures to make them look real and presentable. Let's take a moment to talk about RAW versus JPEG file formats. When you take a picture with a digital camera, it's stored on the memory card. It's going to be stored in either a JPEG format or a RAW format. And we've talked about this several times, but I haven't really done the subject justice. I've kind of just barely introduced it. So here let's look at a chart to compare the differences between RAW and JPEG. First is the file size, and this is a dramatic difference. Raw images are going to be like 20 or 30 megabytes each, whereas a JPEG image is only going to be 3 to 5, maybe 6 megabytes. This means you're going to fill up maybe a gigabyte of space on your drive with just 50 pictures in RAW format, where you can take many, many times more in JPEG, so that is something to consider. The reason RAW formats are so much bigger is because they share a lot more information. The dynamic range in terms of the tones that are stored in the picture is extensive in a RAW format. There's a lot of information there, whereas a JPEG is kind of limited and flat. It's just what you see is what you get. You can't do much with it. Similarly, the white balance setting on your camera is irrelevant when you take a RAW image, but it's critical with a JPEG. This is because, again, the RAW format stores tons of information that can be adjusted in post-production, whereas the JPEG gets rid of this. It's called a lossy format. It gets rid of a lot of the information that would otherwise be present. And if you're shooting a lot of pictures really fast, you're going to have to slow down with the RAW format because you'll reach your camera's buffer quicker, whereas a JPEG can be written to the card a lot faster. This is hardly an issue for food photography, which rarely moves around quickly and jumps in front of you, so that's probably not a huge issue. But if you're doing a lot of sports or action shots, you can run into an issue with shooting too many RAW photos. Also, compatibility. When I say this, I mean, what can you do with the images right out of the camera? If you're taking a JPEG, you can simply take the picture and upload it to the internet right away, whereas a RAW format is much more specialized, and you'll need like a specialized editing application like Photoshop or Lightroom or a few others to edit the image and then convert it to a JPEG or a PNG, which can be shared around the internet and other places. You do need more specialized software like Lightroom or Photoshop when you're editing a RAW format. Now, a lot of people wonder if the quality is better with the RAW image, and that's a hard question to answer because at the end of the day, you're shooting the same picture with the same sensor, with the same lens, whether it's a JPEG or a RAW format. So you're still going to have the same number of megapixels, and actually the images look better right out of the camera in JPEG format because they've been kind of edited and compressed on the back end of the camera to make them look presentable, where a RAW format isn't going to look quite as good in its RAW format, but as soon as you upload it into Lightroom, it's smart enough to know that it's RAW, and it will adjust all the features to make it look great. So it's kind of hard to compare the image quality. At the end, you're going to have a better quality image because you can do more adjustments with RAW, but they are shot out of the same camera, so you're not getting anything special with the RAW format. It doesn't make your camera look better. It just gives you more control over the editing aspects. And I should mention again that most point-and-shoot cameras, like 98% of them, don't shoot in RAW format. Your iPhone certainly doesn't shoot in RAW format. It's only the DSLRs that shoot in RAW, and they all do this. They also have an option to shoot in JPEG. So if you like, you can shoot in JPEG or RAW with your DSLR. It does give you that option, but if I'm using a DSLR, I'll almost certainly shoot in RAW most of the time. The homework for this lesson is to review these 6 editing effects until you're kind of comfortable with what they do and how they do it and how that's useful for your food photography. Make sure you have a good handle on what contrast means and why you'd want to sharpen your image and why you don't want to sharpen it too much to add too much noise. In the next videos, we'll actually go through a process of doing this and we'll give you some hands-on experience. But for now, just be comfortable with the terms and what they mean. Once you're comfortable, actually take the editing effects quiz that I created for this section of the course. It's a few multiple choice questions and fill in the blank questions that test your understanding of these terms. And I'll see you in the next lesson when we're actually going to do a live screencast of Lightroom to show you how to use these editing effects in real time.